Morning.
Hi Lily.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. This is the Student Futures Commission Students' Union evidence session, supported by Wonky, but very much delivered entirely on our behalf by a group of really amazing students' unions who've been working really hard over the past couple of weeks to talk to students, find out what's going on, and find out from those students what it is it's going to take to help them be successful coming back from the pandemic, both in the year ahead and potentially for future generations of students as well. I am not as technically gifted as some of my colleagues, so if there's any issues popping up in the course of the event, I'll be kind of here in the background as Team Wonky in the chat box. Just do post me a message, and I'll kind of furiously kind of try and manage things behind the scenes if anything goes wrong. But the only thing for me to say before I hand over to Meg is just to let people know that we are recording the event. We will be posting it on the Student Futures Commission website after this. So this will be kind of available for people to kind of look at and engage with into the future. And of course, this will be kind of a record that will feed into the overall recommendations and findings of the Commission. With us today, we've got Mary Kernock-Cook, the Chair of the Commission, but strictly in an observing capacity. If at any point also you have questions for any of our issues, it depends kind of how long each leg takes, each presentation takes, but there may be time for questions, but pop them in. And if we don't get time in the moment, then we'll just, we'll wrap them up and forward them afterwards. I think that's all from me in terms of housekeeping. Meg, over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Debbie. I just really wanted to reiterate what Debbie had been saying about all of the hard work that students' unions have put in over this year. I know that quite a lot of the news is about universities adapting, and obviously we work really closely with them, but also I just wanted to recognise, as someone who's been a student union president, recognising the work of the representatives, but also the core staff who have had to adapt all of their activities and all of their representation communications and things like that. So it's just been such a challenging year, but everyone's really risen to the challenge, and hopefully we'll hear about some of the fantastic things that you've done in these evidence sessions, as well as in the chat box as well. So I don't think I have anything else more to say on that, and if so, we'll go straight away over to Danny from Hearts SU, who's research coordinator. Please.
Wonderful, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to attempt to share my screen, given I'm only used to Teams. Let's hope it works. Wonderful. Yes, I'm Danny Bradford. I'm the research coordinator at Hearts SU. So I'm in charge of gathering all of our student feedback. I run a number of projects each year into the student experience and the student journey. And I have really enjoyed being part of this project. We chose the theme Rebuilding Student Communities After COVID-19, looking at students' friendships and students' opportunities to socialise and connect with other students, how that's been impacted by COVID and what they want going forwards. So we spoke to 12 students and we held 2 separate focus groups. We spoke to students from all different demographic backgrounds. We have a really diverse student population at Hearts, so 55% of our students are BAME. We have a really high proportion of commuter students, mature students and carers. Just as some background, because this work's very much informed by the kind of student population that we have at Hearts. To start with, we spoke a lot in the focus groups about the impact of COVID. One of the things that I found with all focus groups that I've run this year is that students have really kind of been craving actually someone to talk to about how their year's been. And so we spent a long time talking about that, because students really wanted to feel like they were being listened to, I guess, about how difficult really the past year and a half has been for them. So this is a quote from one of our students, particularly talking about how COVID has affected their ability to connect with other students. So the student said, "This year has been really difficult to connect with students and just friends, and overall, not only because you can't really hang out with them, but also it's just hard, it's just hard to meet new people when all you can see is their screens and their cameras and that's it. Or for example, just their Instagram pages. As a student rep myself, it's a common theme where people are having issues connecting with others." So through the focus groups, we found that COVID has had a huge impact on students' ability to connect with other students and to make friends. For students that hadn't experienced Hearts pre-pandemic and had started their course during the pandemic, they largely reported having no friends at all. This was really exacerbated for international students who were less likely to report that they had friends outside of university. So we had lots of international students saying, I just don't have any friends at all in this country. Equally, a lot of international students reported that the reason they came to the UK was not just for the academic provisions, but was to meet people of different cultures and different backgrounds, and that social aspect was a huge decision in them deciding to study in the UK. So that's been a real blow for them. Students who have had a term or more, or perhaps even a year, at Hearts pre-COVID, report having some friends from those years, especially housemates if they lived on campus, but they say it's been much harder to keep in touch with each other, and they feel like all the interactions they have with other students has to be manufactured. It's so almost clinical, because you have to set up a Zoom call or you have to arrange it beforehand. You can't just bump into people and meet naturally. You can't just see someone in the street and go, oh, I haven't seen you in ages, how are you doing? And this has been a kind of huge burden on students, feeling like all of their social interactions are almost inauthentic. In terms of looking forwards for next year and how we can rebuild those communities, the number one thing that students spoke about really was the value of online classes. So this student says offline classes would be the first step to rebuilding student communities, because they are a group we unknowingly become friends with. And I think that really speaks to what I was just mentioning about how students are really missing those authentic, random interactions that you get with just being in the same proximity as someone. The student said last year when we had all classes online, we got used to going to the classes together and then discuss things about the lectures in the library. Then they go out for lunch when we have a break, and it was just a different experience. And the student says, and honestly, COVID has changed everything. So students reported that the number one thing they felt that the university and SUs could do to encourage more social interaction and community building next year was holding more in-person classes. Interestingly, academically, a lot of our students were very happy for some of the teaching, especially large lectures, to be completely online, pre-recorded with no interaction. However, on the other side of this does remove a lot of the opportunities of that natural social interaction and friendship making that I was discussing. So whilst academically they feel that they're not necessarily losing very much by having pre-recorded lectures online, although they would like small seminar groups, socially that does remove those kind of authentic social interactions that students are really craving. Students reported that some of the things that they missed most about pre-COVID life was just bumping into course mates before lectures, in the library, in the coffee shop, and being able to have that interaction on a kind of day-to-day basis. Societies was another key theme that came through from our students. So there's a quote here from a society committee member saying that the key thing they think to rebuilding student communities is really pushing society events, particularly the physical ones. The student said, it's just such a different experience when you're interacting with someone. Doing something online is much different than doing it physically, and it's just a different connection. So student says, I really think pushing things physically is a good way to move forwards. Secondly, to online classes, the students that we spoke to reported that what they missed most about pre-COVID life was societies, but in particular in-person society events. So this year at Hearts, we did make all of our society memberships free to encourage students to have arenas in which they could safely socialise and to help develop and support their well-being, but students have struggled to interact with these online events, and they're really missing these face-to-face society events. A lot of students reported that actually these face-to-face physical society events where they could meet people with similar interests to them were actually the best part of their university life pre-COVID. We did ask what type of events students wanted. Students really, as a whole, didn't mind as long as they were face-to-face. There were some concerns about logistics, especially for community students. So at Hearts, even post-COVID, we're pursuing a more blended and flexible approach to learning. It's likely that some teaching will still be online. And community students did say, I'm not going to come in for an hour society face-to-face event if I'm not scheduled to be on campus all day and it takes me 2 hours to commute there. But they would come in for, say, a half a day social event. They just wanted the event to be longer than the time that they would have spent traveling. Equally for community students, they didn't want anything really early in the morning or really late at night. But as long as logistically they could make it and it was face-to-face, students were really keen to attend. However, when pushed, students did mention that their favourite types of events were anything that they deemed to be new, things they hadn't tried before and were different to their courses. So students particularly talked about arenas where they can debate. Our debate society has been one of our most successful this year. Arenas where they can learn about different communities. So students spoke about how being at Hearts was the first time that they'd learned about the LGBT community, for example. We have a really active LGBTQ plus society at Hearts. Or things like volunteering as well, anything that you get a certification from at the end, things like volunteering and student leadership development programs, our students were really keen on. However, we spoke to a number of society committee members, and they really kind of highlighted the issue of engaging students in these events. So while students are kind of reporting that they would really like these events, the committee members are worried about being able to actually get students to attend and being able to ensure that students know about the events running. So this student said, spreading information about society events is a constant battle. It isn't about how much you spread. The student said, you know, they have Instagram, Twitter pages, a page on our website, they send out emails. It's not about how much you spread, it's about the quality of it. But it's not about spreading on Instagram or email or whatever it is. It's just that there's a way of connecting that we're not getting it yet, because you're all busy, you know, you're all students, we're all busy. And we don't really, I think I can speak for all society committees, that we don't know really how to make it work, like what's the key. And so I think that student unions and universities are going to be really needing to all hands on deck support societies next year to ensure that societies feel that they have the resources and the knowledge to be able to run these events that the students seem to really want for next year. We talked a lot about barriers to rebuilding student communities next year. So not just what students want, but what might stop us from getting there. So this student said, you can't also ignore just the fear. There's a lot of fear for the virus. There's a lot of people who are probably not in the UK at all. And we can't just dismiss them. So I think it's just creating the opportunity as much as possible for people to, on their own terms, just try to break that barrier and actually come outside. But it isn't easy. There's clearly a huge amount of health and COVID-related anxiety, at least in our student population. From other research we've carried out this year, we found that students, particularly BAME students, disabled and high-risk students and carers, were really concerned about the safety of campuses. Students were also concerned about attending events even that were within restrictions and safely run, and then potentially, especially by the media, being blamed for any rise in cases or being seen as careless or ungrateful by their lecturers, who they recognise have put a huge amount of work this year into being able to deliver teaching in a really difficult time. In September, there will be students who cannot attend in-person events. So as much as loads of our students want these events, there's going to be a lot of students that can't, for whether that's for health concerns or because they're in another country or quarantining or isolating. And we need to make sure that these students aren't left behind. Anxiety, social anxiety came up a huge amount in the focus groups we ran. The students said there's a lot of anxiety in our university, and a lot of people just feel anxiety about messaging people, and it feels quite like a boredom and more just quite annoying messaging people, even if it's just to make friendly conversation. And this student spoke about kind of being on the other end of this, talking about how they feel really shy to start a conversation, but if someone comes up to them and starts one, then they try to push themselves and open up. But if it's online, they shy away and then they don't want to put in any more effort. But if it's a physical interaction, then the person is in front of you, so you have to answer. So maybe that pushes me to make new friends or talk to other people. It was really clear from talking to our students that students had developed a lot of anxiety during the pandemic. Our students report having forgotten how to interact and connect with other students and staff. When teaching is online, they struggle to reach out to other students and staff. They keep their microphones and cameras off. And if they do push themselves to reach out, they find that it's harder to tell someone's tone of voice. Are they being sarcastic? Are they annoyed? Are they trying to make a joke? And really importantly, I think students have reported that this has sometimes resulted in tensions and arguments in group chats, and exacerbated biases and stereotypes about different student groups, particularly different racial and cultural student groups. We had students reporting that they felt that not being face-to-face had almost, or they felt that if they had been face-to-face, then students that had come to university, perhaps with racial stereotypes or cultural stereotypes, that would have been broken down in the interaction that they had with other students, especially at Hearts. We have such a diverse student population, but because they haven't had that face-to-face interaction, and because it's so easy for things to be misconstrued online and tone gets lost, that this has been a real issue this year, and it's almost cemented those stereotypes about different groups of students. As restrictions do lift and campuses open up more, students may need support in rebuilding their social confidence. When asked what students felt would be a good way of achieving this, they spoke about how it would be important to invest in and promote schemes like student buddy schemes and society events where they can meet people with similar interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Danny. I found that incredibly insightful, and particularly around some of the things that you mentioned to do with student demographics as well, in particular around international students and how their experiences might not be in comparison to their expectations around when they came to the UK and things like that as well. So that's great. Also, I think really importantly around the support from the university that you said for student union events and societies, and about how the buy-in from the university is incredibly important for supporting those students who run those events and go to those events as well. That's great, thank you. Do we have any questions in the chat, Debbie?
Sorry, playing with buttons. Not at the minute, but I would emphasize that attendees and panelists, you're all very welcome to pop a question there if you would like. And I mean, and Danny, I suppose I'm curious from my point of view, and the reason Meg probably didn't ask this is because she probably knows the answer, but you know, how much support do society committees get as a rule? I'm sure it's really variable, but in terms of thinking about, because I think you know that seems to be a really important recommendation that you picked out, is that kind of how do you kind of build events that people are going to want to engage with? How do you plan them far enough advance so that people can kind of plan their timing, and how do you get the word out in a kind of consistent and impactful way? I mean, that's a really kind of quite advanced skill set, actually. If I think about kind of, you know, the amount of effort and we put into wonky events. So I wonder kind of, you know, is that somewhere where student unions could kind of look and think a little bit more about where they can kind of up the ante in terms of supporting those society committees?
Yeah, so at Hearts we have 2 permanent members of staff who support the societies, one who works with mainly with the academic societies, and one works with the non-academic societies. We provide training for all society committee members on things like how to engage, how to market your events, things like we would provide EDI training. But what students, interestingly, were talking about the type of support they wanted was not necessarily from the SU, but was actually from academic staff, particularly when talking about academic societies, because, for example, the lecturers and the module leaders are the staff that students are most interacting with, even online. So the society committee members were saying, you know, if they pushed our events more, then that's a great kind of communication avenue for students that might actually, you know, not check our Instagram or might not engage with the SU social medias, and how that they really felt that the academic staff had a big part to play in promoting events, especially regarding academic societies. So I think that that's going to be a big thing for next year. And I think from across the sector, from what I know, you know, different issues, depending on what resources they have very variable support for societies, depending on how many staff they have and how much, how large their grant is. I think that universities really investing in the SU in generally, and particularly in societies, would have real value in the kind of years to come.
We've got thanks, Danny. That's brilliant. We've got a few questions coming in on the Q&A box as well. So if I pick those up, so Callum Roberts asked, how many students did you speak to in the focus groups? So just a little point of.
Yeah, so 12 students over 2 focus groups. So we had about 6 in each focus group.
And Ben Viliami has asked, is there evidence that students feel, see or experience a tension or contradiction between face-to-face activities but lack of face-to-face teaching? So, you know, I suppose would students feel like, well, if we're able to get together for a society event, why can't we have face-to-face teaching? I guess is kind of the implication there.
Yeah, so I think, so I mentioned how with the big lectures, so say you have like 300 people in a lecture, none of the students reported that they want to go and learn in a lecture with 300 other students. The part, like academically, but the part that they missed was being able to bump into people, the social aspect. However, students really do want those small seminar groups. There was a lot of talk in our focus groups about how they miss in-person group work. So I think it depends what universities will prioritise in September. If they prioritise small group seminar teaching that's allowed to be face-to-face and kind of in-person group work, but they keep the lectures online, the big lectures, from the students that I've spoken to, I think that most students will be pretty happy with that. But if they say everything is online, but you can come in for some social events if you want to, I think that even if students aren't particularly unhappy about it, I think if nothing else, the messaging is just confusing, you know, in terms of the public health measures we should be taking and then the reasons behind the decisions. So I think if nothing else, it would just be confusing. But I imagine from what I've heard, most universities are going to be pursuing these kind of small seminar in-person teaching where possible, keep most big lectures online, and allow some social events where safe, which I think is probably the best we can hope for going into September.
And a question from Lauren Harrison. How much importance do your students place in student reps, academic reps, course reps, particularly in terms of facilitating connections? Oh, really interesting question.
Yeah, so not as much as I had thought they would. So there wasn't very much mention of student reps, apart from in how they could be useful spreading information to other students about events, because at Hearts, each student rep has like a group chat with their course. And so it's a great way to be able to spread information between different students. I spoke to a couple of students who weren't very active on social media, didn't really like social media. And they said that all the information they got was through the group chats that their student reps had set up. Otherwise they missed everything because they didn't have Instagram, they didn't have Twitter. So it's quite important in terms of communicating of information, but not in terms of that kind of necessary in terms of that connectedness and that socializing. Students created their own group chats, not kind of facilitated by group reps or student leaders for that socializing aspect. So students spoke about how in class they won't have their microphone or camera on, but they'll all be messaging on their WhatsApp thing, being like, oh, what's he talking about? I don't understand it. And when I said, you know, if you have a question, why don't you just put your hand up? They said because they don't have the confidence, and so they'll put it in the group chat. Because they're hoping that someone else has the same question to make them feel that they're not stupid or they're not, you know, asking a silly question. So in short, I think the reps and student leaders play a big part in communicating of information, but I think the students seem to find their own avenues for that connectedness that wasn't necessarily facilitated by the reps and the student leaders.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got more questions flooding in now than we can actually handle. So I think Meg, if it's okay with you, we'll cut it off there. Some of them are essentially kind of, you know, what is the best way to communicate with students, which I suspect is just a little bit bigger than we can cover today. But I think that is going to be something that lots of people are going to have to think about. Meg, is there anything that you wanted to pick up from what you've seen coming in?
I just wanted to make a comment on what Danny had just mentioned in terms of, it's almost like you said, that authentic sort of group formation. Actually, you turn to your friend in a lecture and ask the question to each other and then answer it in person. And actually that's just reflected online. And I think Ben put in the chat around social skills and about how potentially there's an avenue around that of developing confidence and skills to be able to put themselves out there, because actually it's what you said in your presentation as well, in terms of just being able to have that extra step of being able to ask those questions and speak to new people as well. So yeah, no, I thought it was fantastic. I don't know if we've got anything else to pick up, or if not, we'll move on to our next presentation. Thank you very much, Danny. That was fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. We'll go to Lily from Leicester now.
Hiya, I'm also not the best technically, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Jim's given me a tip, but I don't know if I actually understand it, so I'm just going to give it a go. Desktop, PowerPoint. Can you see anything?
Not as of yet, but I have faith.
Bear with me.
It's all right.
If not, what I'll do is I'll just talk through it because there's no images or anything. So, oh, right. No, I'm not going to be able to share it for now just because I'll have to quit Zoom. Never mind, I'll go through and talk anyway. You'll just have to see my face. What I will do is I will share the presentation with you all. I knew something like this would happen. Okay, so my name's Lily and I am the Research and Insight Manager at Leicester Students' Union. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm currently looking at the presentation. So if you've got any questions, I will answer them at the end. To give you a bit of a content warning, we're not necessarily going to be talking about anything too traumatic, but what the focus, our focus groups was re-establishing student community within Black student communities and supporting our Black students at Leicester. Therefore, there are some mentions of racial trauma, so I just want to caveat that before I begin my presentation, and if there's anything that you feel uncomfortable with, please feel free to leave. So to give you a flavour of the local context of Leicester, a bit like Danny said, we are an incredibly diverse university and have a majority BAME student population. Digging a bit deeper into that, the percentage of our UK domiciled Black students is higher than the UK average when I looked at HESA. So they're a big part of our student community at Leicester. However, when we look at external data sets such as the NSS, particularly the Learning Communities question, there are big score disparities between Black students and the student population on the whole, and particularly between Black and white students. Therefore, we wanted to focus on re-establishing student communities within for our Black students, as that was a challenge already before COVID. So we know from COVID that COVID's exacerbated so many of the things that already existed. Therefore, we thought it needed some special attention. Further, when we look at the demographics of our student groups within the Students' Union, Black students are underrepresented by about half compared to the student population that they have. Oh, thank you so much. That's a massive help. So they're underrepresented by about half as participants, and then as committee members, they are underrepresented to the point that we don't have reporting statistics. So there's obviously a clear disparity there between the actual community that we have at Leicester and the community that the SU seems to engage. So that is what we wanted to focus on. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so our group that we, well, I say group, it was a pair. So that's a limitation in itself, which I'm happy to discuss at the end. So we focused on final year UK domiciled Black students. We had 2 people attend the focus group. We had 3 dropouts actually, which is probably something that we need to think about as well in terms of our messaging. And we offered a £10 incentive to encourage people to come. Traditionally, this time of year, we really struggle with engagement, and because of the way that we tailor our comms and our data protection agreements and things, we struggle to do things like just send out an email. So that's, I guess, a different challenge for the SU, but it means that we often struggle to kind of engage people who aren't in the, I guess, the engaged students that always turn up to everything. So to try and get a different audience, we advertised through targeted messaging. So what we did was we spoke to students engaged in some societies such as the ACS Society, and basically got them to talk to their friends who perhaps aren't necessarily involved in the SU, but would be interested in giving their opinions on COVID and COVID support. As I mentioned, we have challenges in engagement there, which is something that we're hoping to work on through segmentation, but as I said, that's a question, that's a conversation for another day. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I feel like the government people at the moment. So we wanted to kind of target like 2 kind of main aims, asking students what measures and support that we can put in place just to support them to feel at home at uni post-COVID, but also specifically looking at what we could put in place for Black students. The themes that we focused on, a bit like Danny, were community, but I noticed this with Danny's presentation as well. Other themes came up because I think community and feeling part of something is really important in terms of your mental health, in terms of engaging with teaching and achieving your learning outcomes, and then moving forward, employability. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before I begin, we basically just had a chat at the beginning about COVID and the current climate and how our students were kind of, I guess, feeling about it in general. So because of COVID and the impact that it had on things like teaching, it had basically increased stress in our students. So our students had increased stress because they had graduate jobs to apply for. They had increased stress because the academic commitments maybe weren't what they were expecting. There wasn't the communication with their courses that they were expecting and used to, which meant that perhaps small problems began to escalate. We've got all of that. Then if we think back to this time last year, we had a lot of the really traumatic events with George Floyd, which affected our Black community enormously. And then you have COVID on top of that. And so you've got all of the aspects of being like doing all your exams, you've got the external pressures outside of COVID. And then you've got no outlet at the end of that to be able to actually sort of maybe relieve some of that stress. So one of the students we spoke to, they said that perhaps if they were able to go out and play football with their friends, maybe they wouldn't have felt so bad, but because they had all of this pressure and then no outlet to be able to relieve that, it had a massive impact on their mental health. Not only has this had an impact on mental health, but it's also had an impact on potential graduate opportunities and employment. So the lack of communication with some departments, plus all of the pressure, has led to, from this group anyway, and I acknowledge this is a small group, so I'm not sure if we can generalise this, but people applying for panic masters just to take the pressure off, the feeling that I guess they're cash cows or that people don't care about them, which has led to a lack of motivation. So they just feel like they've been left behind, they don't really know what to do, they haven't got a clear sense of direction, therefore they're taking, and I don't think it's the easy option out, but in their eyes that they're taking this option because at least then it gives them a year to kind of take a step back and have a breather. So we've got these challenges that have happened with students feeling let down, with low morale, but then on socialisation, as we are kind of improving socialisation again, even extroverts, so the two people in the group that I was speaking to both made comments about how they were extroverted people, that even for them it didn't feel natural to go to events and communicate in person. They didn't really know how to approach other people, and they didn't notice the impact that this had had on them, I guess, until they were in that situation themselves. So they kind of they had identified this as a kind of an indicator that their mental health was poorer than perhaps they were expected. They didn't realise themselves at the time. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Thanks. So we've got the context there. I guess one of the things that we spoke about was the importance of community to them and what it took for them to kind of build connections with people. And I think the three key things that came out were having the same lived experiences, or having the same identity as somebody else. Course was a big one, and common interests. So that could fall under sports and societies, but it could also fall under just common interests that fall outside the box of, I guess, the co-curricular activities. So with identity and lived experiences, one, I've got a few quotes here. So I grew up in a predominantly white area, so being able to find individuals who understand what it's like to be the only Black person in a predominantly white space is important. And then if I can click with you on a lived experience level, we are more likely to get along. It was really emphasised in the group that, thank you, it was really emphasised in the group that having that lived experience there, it kind of took the pressure off. So it was that commonality. They already had that shared experience. They already, I guess, had an understanding of perhaps what each other was like or what they were going through. What that meant was that I guess they already had, I guess, made their minds up or decided that, okay, this is someone that I can invest my time in. This is someone who I can trust. But as I said, like, lived experiences is a really important one, but course and common interests as well were incredibly important. And as much as it's important, I guess, to be friends with people who you relate with and are similar to, one of the other key themes was that university was such a fantastic experience in which you can make friends with loads of different people who perhaps you never thought that you would be able to form bonds with, which actually surprised both of the participants. So it says here, goes to show that everyone in the world has a lot in common. And I think that COVID, as tragic as it is something that a lot of students and graduates are going to have in common, and it's something that I think moving forwards could be used as almost like a leveller. So everyone's had this shared experience, therefore it could actually in itself increase community building. Can I have the next slide, please? I'll just skip this one. So basically, this one was that, so the commonalities exist. So we know that everyone's got lots of things in common, but we still have these challenges with building community. So there's obviously some external factors there which are preventing the community building happening. So this is what we're going to unpack in the next few slides. Okay, so firstly, I'd like to talk about events and a lack of tailored events for students to meet people like them. So what was clear in these groups was that it's not necessarily that the SU was to put on an X event or Y event. It's the fact that there needs to be environments in which people feel comfortable going with, being themselves, to be able to build those opportunities. Therefore, events that are ran, I guess, by the SU, by the university, by student groups, it's that they provide the space, therefore they're really important. Now, as I mentioned, Leicester's got an incredibly diverse student population, but as mentioned here, it's great to say we're diverse, but it's not reflected in the social offering. So there was a really big conversation between the two students that university events are tailored to a subset of the student population. They didn't use these words, but I would say the white student population, particularly the white middle class student population, and are not reflective of the incredibly diverse student body. This led to Black students feeling othered and more isolated, particularly when these events, so these were online events, and then as distancing things relaxed, socially distanced, I guess, club events you call them. People sit at tables, but it's still, I guess, like a club vibe. These events were marketed to try and make up for the reduced social contact, but didn't actually resonate with the students that they were trying to attract. the example that they gave was that the nights out that the student union advertises, now it's an external company, but we partner with them, they tend to run the same kind of R&B dance nights, and the music is quite, it's kind of just like one thing, and they wanted more diverse music types because it would attract Black communities to the events, and give them a space to feel like they can be themselves and feel included. Whereas because all of the advertising went into these events that attracted a predominantly white audience, they felt othered and therefore didn't want to engage. So when we kind of talk about tailored events, it was mentioned that the only tailored events available are run by students for students, meaning they lack the money and the funding and the advertising to be able to reach a wide selection of students, as well as putting the onus on the students who are being marginalised to create their own entertainment when other students, so particularly white students, can go to university and all of these things are just put on offer for them. Because the advertising relies on the student groups themselves to do it, students who are not in the know or perhaps not engaged with certain groups miss events that are not advertised centrally. So our nights out kind of providers, they get email addresses, they get people to sign up, they're constantly texting students. So the students kind of bombarded with these opportunities. But as you can imagine, if it's something that you're not interested in or kind of is a bit tone deaf to your wants and needs, it can feel a bit isolating. And then I'm going to draw your attention to this quote at the bottom. So never anything for people of all backgrounds, it's described as tunnel vision, concentrated to a certain type of person, that does not represent the university as a whole, not a very good representation of what we are about as a university. And I thought that was a really interesting comment, because I felt like it meant that the actual sort of events that they were running, obviously these students have got a kind of an idea in their head about what Leicester is and the community that they are part of. So perhaps it's not that the communities don't exist, it's just that student unions to some extent don't fit within those communities, and that's something that we need to change. Thank you. The second part is to do with engaging with student groups and co-curricular opportunities. Again, we had a theme here of groups, and this is in particular liberation spaces, being very important but saturated with one type of person. Now, the students who took part really kind of, it wasn't that they were dismissing co-curricular opportunities. In fact, they saw them as incredibly important, and they both saw them as well as integral to them actually getting graduate employment, as it enabled them to gain transferable skills and learn who they were as a person, and then be able to I think one of the participants mentioned, like, it gave them a bit of something about them, something special that helped them stand out. So it's incredibly important in that sense, as well as making friends. However, what they did find was that particularly in liberation spaces, so one of the people that we spoke to was Black and part of the LGBT community. So what they found was that they felt like they couldn't really be themselves in either space. So the predominantly white LGBT group, they felt like perhaps they didn't have as much in common. So I think they mentioned just something about, again, music. So music was quite a common theme actually, with like the group would talk about specific kind of artists and stuff. And the student would feel kind of, I guess, on the outskirts. Whereas if they were to go to an ACS event, so that's the Afro-Caribbean Society, they would feel included, obviously, because it was majority Black people there, but they wouldn't know, I guess, who to be safe with in terms of their LGBT identity. So again, we've got this quote at the bottom, which says, you can never be fully yourself or initially be yourself, because you're still working out if it's a safe space. And again, this is extra labour that these students are having to kind of deal with, to actually do something that's meant to relieve stress or meant to be fun. So if you think about COVID and COVID kind of making people more sort of anxious about kind of socializing, if we think about, we've got this on top of it, it's actually quite a lot of pressure there from students. Can I go on to point 3, please? Thank you. Then the final one was one that I wasn't expecting, actually. So this kind of came not necessarily as a surprise, but I just wasn't expecting it to be such a theme as it was challenging the notions of what's normal and expected within communities. So when the students were talking together, they really put the emphasis on the fact that they felt like they had to be perfectionists in everything that they did. So the example that one of them gave was particularly around the SU, that they felt like sometimes they didn't belong because they didn't feel Black enough, or they didn't feel like they knew enough. And they wanted the emphasis actually to be on, actually, it's not about being perfect. It's meant to be a space where you can socialize and make friends. It shouldn't be a space that feels exclusionary. So that's something we really need to work on. And so we had that kind of side of things, which is more to do with the Students' Union. But looking outside of the Students' Union, it's challenging notions of what's normal and expected within the communities they're already part of. So this idea that they mentioned about Black people kind of being generalised, and that they're expected to sort of get on with certain people and they're expected not to get on with certain people, and all that they want is just to be accepted for who they are. And they want to not be judged by if they want to actually try something new, and get rid of that "it's not for me, they're not my type of people" kind of mentality, and stop that kind of perception of being judged. So if I try this, will people look at me in a different way? I thought that was quite, I don't know, it's a difficult one to kind of get your head around, but I thought that it was probably one of the more important things that came out. I do have some solutions that the students did come up with themselves on the next slide, so hopefully we'll be able to sort of mitigate some of these things. So the first is that the university or SU should have not just nights out, like we're talking coffee activities as well, but broader interest themes that are actually tailored to the student body. And if it's not their area of expertise, bring people in to do the events because the demand is there. Further, if you're going to expect the student groups to do those events, you invest in those student groups and you give them the same levels of advertising that perhaps the SU Club Night providers do. You give them the money and you give them the support and the infrastructure. It's not an either or. I think both of them need to happen to be able to provide the spaces in which students feel like they can actually socialise and build communities with each other. Third point there is collaboration between different student groups or activities to challenge notions of norm. So what one of the students kind of came up with was that if they had like a visual advertising campaign that had like the I think the example they gave was like, well, what if the captain of the football team likes ballet? What's wrong with that? But why can't we have these, I guess, well-known people within the student community come out and say these things to try and break down those barriers for other students who perhaps aren't as perhaps a bit more shy or aren't as outgoing. And then the last thing, and this is, I think, more specifically to do with COVID, was that have more informal interest-based events that tend to happen in first year, but have them across the entirety of the university experience. because they're a good way of students being able to informally build connections with no bookings, walk in, walk out, just making it easier to engage than not. This would hopefully form a bridge to reduce anxieties and for people taking part, to then actually take part in maybe some more central activities, and reduce some of that COVID anxiety. That's the end of the formal slides, and I'm aware that I guess some of this doesn't seem like it's kind of COVID specific. However, this was what the students came out with as what was important, so I think that just shows how important it is in terms of inclusion. And as I said, COVID has really kind of widened a lot of these gaps we've got, so I found the session really illuminating, and I hope you did too. So thank you very much for listening to me witter on.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Lily. And I think, like you said, it definitely was illuminating. And I think with this building back higher, this new normal, it's about making sure that the new normal is as inclusive and representative as possible. And I think that despite your small sample size, it was really powerful in terms of the conversation and the things that you got out of it as well. In particular, I found around safe spaces and intersectionality, which is something that is incredibly important for students. So yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm really aware of the time, and I wondered whether if people had questions, if they wanted to pop them in the chat, and if Lily, you wanted to reply in the chat, that would be fantastic. Not to kind of push you off, but
that's absolutely fine. Sorry, I didn't realise how over I'd gone.
No, don't worry at all. That's amazing. Thank you. So thank you very much, Lily. And now we'll go on to Ryan from City SU. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to quickly share my screen as well. Hopefully you should all be able to see that as well. So yes, we're going to be talking about our research into employability. I've also got Rakea here with me as well, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ryan. So my name is Rakea. I am the Vice President Education at the City Students' Union. So I'm one of the sabbatical officers.
So to talk a little bit about our research that we did, we wanted to look into employability because of the sort of statistics that came out of the Commission survey, so that half of students have no confidence about the job market when they graduate, and also that a third of students are worried that their degree won't help them secure a graduate job. And so because of this, we wanted to look into what is causing students to have little confidence in the job market and worry about the value of their degree, how we can make students more confident going into the post-graduation job market, and what more can universities and unions do to support students looking for jobs and feel confident about applying for jobs. So what did we find out?
So we found out that confidence was something that was really important, and in trying to find out why the lack of confidence in getting a graduate job was important, students told us that they perceive the job market to be awful, extremely competitive and bleak. In particular, students feel infuriated and confused by the process of applying for jobs. And when we spoke to them, students mentioned that rejections for jobs and not hearing back from employers were some of the reasons why they weren't feeling positive about the whole getting a job process. And students just also described being disheartened by multiple rejections and the silence of getting no response from employers. So as a students' union, we can consider what more businesses, organisations and industries could do to instill this confidence in students and graduates that is so lacking and is obviously needed. So asking how their processes can help to encourage graduates and create confidence amongst students and recent graduates. And when we spoke to students, they believe that they should be taught how to bounce back from rejection and how to deal with these knocks to confidence around jobs and applying for new roles. Students agreed that the importance of activities beyond their degree was really something that helped in making them more employable. So they agreed that the importance of wider experience and extracurriculars before the pandemic were really important, and that there was a consensus that the COVID-19 pandemic had detrimentally limited opportunities such as volunteering, internships and soft skill development. So the lack of access to these sorts of opportunities were causing students to feel less confident about applying for jobs and how employable they considered themselves to be. And students described a genuine difficulty in finding experience when they were working remotely. Many businesses and organizations were not providing the usual work experience that would be provided if they were in person. And the lack of exposure to this professional working environment was something that students stated as really knocking their confidence. And it often created uncertainty about what roles they should be applying for. The students that we spoke to considered their experience to be the most important aspect of finding a job post-graduation, and that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, they felt that they were often lacking in this. So in terms of post-pandemic opportunities, for some students, the pandemic brought newfound opportunities through digital internships and online work experience opportunities. So they were going for roles that they wouldn't ordinarily have gone for if it was in person. And so the pandemic has delivered genuinely useful opportunities through remote working and the flexibility that it provides. And students praise things like online internships and the ability to get experiences in places that they would not be able to physically travel to. Some international students were able to engage in online internships from their home countries, which is something that is unusual. For other students, they saved on travel expenses and accommodation fees, so the online industry experiences were really beneficial to them in more than one way. And mainly students suggested that online opportunities were primarily useful in being able to get a taste in different industries, and this is something that they would like to see continued post-pandemic, but not as a replacement for in-person experiences. Students have also been forced by the pandemic to adapt and develop skills in digital literacy. Students have used new technologies as a result of remote learning that they can now use in whatever industry that they choose to go into. This appeared to give students a sense of confidence, and they felt more equipped because of these new skills so that they could progress to post-graduation jobs with a better skill set. They also felt more efficient in managing their time due to remote learning, and they felt that they could adapt to new situations better because of the pressures that the pandemic put on them. This gave them a sense of confidence, and these were skills that they especially said were important that they wanted to continue to take into the world of work.
And when we were talking about sort of like the elements of employability and those sorts of skills that students felt they'd lost, that they kept on repeating the idea of networking as one of the areas that they've not been able to sort of get involved in during the pandemic, and the online networking opportunities that are often provided by City or by the union don't provide the same sorts of opportunities that it was if it was in person. And so students were essentially saying their ability to network effectively and made work experience and internships really quite difficult. Students described needing that in-person contact to genuinely form useful relationships that might enable them to try and get a job or give them the confidence to go about applying for jobs. And they were saying that actually that there's been really a few valuable opportunities to create professional networks, and the connections that were fostered were considered less meaningful, often because they felt uncomfortable at times about contacting individuals when they were working at home, or the knowledge that the people they were contacting were at home, which was quite interesting. Students often spoke about how panels and sort of like guest speaker events can be really interesting to attend, and sort of the fact that a lot of those have moved virtually has been really beneficial, as they gave sort of great insights into individuals' career paths and where they can go to post-graduation. But it was the ability to build a professional network from some of those events that was often seen as the most important aspect. And students spoke about the time, sort of the 10, 15 minutes, if it was in person, that you would sort of get to chat to some of the speakers and chat to some of the attendees. That was sort of the really useful time, and that was very difficult to try and replicate online. And so therefore, some of the online panels and events like that weren't as beneficial in enabling them to try and build a network of connections. There was also the sort of the expectations that students were expected to know how to network or how to build professional networks, and felt like they were getting little support in how to do so. So they were saying how sort of if they attend an event and it doesn't go very well, that's sort of a barrier then in future to attend other sorts of events. And they kept on repeating the idea of training on soft skills such as communication, marketing yourself, and networking, which could be sort of facilitated to address some of these issues and enable students to sort of network effectively. And in terms of support, students said how career support and well-being support should are and should be closely intertwined. And students were saying how they're sort of less likely to feel confident applying for jobs if they're experiencing negative mental health issues or struggling with their academic studies. And that could be sort of a barrier for them applying for jobs or having sort of a sense of confidence to apply for jobs. He also said that sort of careers services provisions, specifically at City, but sort of said it could be more of a general thing, were considered too broad and not tailored to student-specific needs. As I said, this potentially tells a wider story about what types of careers support students want to receive and what type of career support will make them feel comfortable and confident. So they said how CV checking is just not adequate to support their needs, or it's just not enough. That sort of specific courses or departments who provide more tailored support for their industry were praised. However, students raised the idea that support should instead be weaved in throughout students' years of study. They kept on repeating the idea that actually if employability or career support was embedded in something like personal tutoring, that would be a really beneficial thing for students, as they were sort of able to build a relationship with a key member of staff at City, and that those sorts of regular meetings could be used to build up a timeline of expectations, which could be communicated to students. They quite like this idea of sort of knowing when that they should be doing things or when would be useful to do things in order to build networks or volunteer or gain experience and seek other opportunities. And then they could sort of hold themselves to measure about whether actually they were up to a certain standard, but that could also be used to motivate students in terms of doing more than they currently were. But I think what sort of talking to the various students that we spoke to in the focus groups showed that it just really employability support and career support was not a one-size-fits-all model. And that's why sort of generic careers advice is not seen as acceptable to students and wasn't instilling them with a sense of confidence, because it can't be general and it needs to be personal in order to support them.
So as Ryan just said, there is no universal answer for when career support should be delivered for students. There was an overwhelming agreement that career support should not begin aggressively when students have their first terms at City. That was something that there was consensus on. For undergraduate students, they clearly felt that the second year was an optimal time to encourage them to get into career support and gain more experiences and soft skills that would support them into post-graduation employment. The exact timing of support was debated amongst the students, with students who are on vocational courses preferring tailored support throughout the year based on their needs. So some students believe that career support should start at the beginning of their degree, but what is clear is that there is a need for a timeline that allows students to adapt and follow it according to their circumstances in order to guide their experience of university through the lens of employability. If expectations were established early on, then students stated that they would be more aware of where they should be seeking support from. So whether that's the career services, the student union, or from their course. And it was clear that more support is needed in terms of building the students' confidence in the job market. And it should include things like how they should be becoming aware of opportunities. So things like work experience, part-time jobs, and this information is particularly important at the end of the year when students seem to have more time on their hands, as opposed to sort of throughout the year when they're getting teaching or during exam season. So when we're thinking about what sort of support should be offered and when, students describe the need for the higher education department and organisations to acknowledge the impact of the pandemic, but particularly coming out of the pandemic and looking at what their needs will be then. So thank you so much for listening to us. And yeah, if we have time for questions, then we can take any.
Thank you so much, both. That was a great presentation and really resonated with me in terms of some of the things you were saying around embedding employability throughout the sort of student life cycle. And it kind of connects to one of the previous ones around panic masters and feeling quite indecisive towards the end of their degree as well. So I found that really interesting. I was wondering if you had any sort of comments or information that you've got around articulation of employability skills that have been developed and whether there's any sort of work to be done on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sort of there was just the sense that because of the pandemic for a lot of students, that opportunities that were previously there weren't there in the past year. And so therefore they've struggled to know what skills they were meant to be articulating because they weren't having sort of the opportunities and the experiences in the first place. So we're sort of we often talk about sort of societies, for example, really giving students sort of skills which they can take forward. If they weren't able to get involved in as many activities in such societies, then it's going to be even harder because they're not quite sure what skills that they've gained, even though there's definitely been other opportunities. And I think that's why it was quite interesting when we're talking about sort of adaptability and digital literacy as sorts of skills that students have gained through the pandemic and just having to adapt to so many different things. That those are some of the other skills that sort of need to be articulated. And it was quite interesting that the students were recognizing those skills that they'd actually that they gained, and there was definitely sort of a sense of, in the focus groups you could see heads nodding and sort of agreeing that, oh yeah, that's things I picked up on. So it'll be interesting actually how sort of institutions and SUs as well help students articulate some of those things that they have gained through the pandemic as well as lost.
Yeah, and what was it like in terms of like subject spread? Were there areas which were lost out a lot more, or?
In terms of sort of in actual sort of like degrees and
yeah, and the things that you got from your sort of evidence sessions?
Yeah, I think sort of it was there was some areas where it was like practical skills because there were some students that had practical courses that were able to go on and continue in some capacity. So they were sort of able to articulate those, but it was really some of the soft skills, and in terms of the links to the experience as opposed to some of the degree aspects that I think really stuck out for students in terms of things that they'd lost or weren't able to articulate.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And Mary shared a link in the chat around MMU's RISE programme, which is credit bearing employability skills, which just to draw people's attention to as well. And then there's some other comments in here as well. Natasha said we offered specific employability sessions for our course reps this year, which have gone down really well. We've had great feedback on stuff like that. So I think that it's definitely becoming something that is becoming embedded in some student union activities. And actually, like you said, it's just about embedding them in the whole student life cycle, in everything that they engage with as well. That's great. I'm just going to have a look in the Q&A box as to if anyone's got any other questions. Nick's put, what kind of links are there currently back to the college and schools career systems, and how is this normalised across all universities?
I think in terms of, for us, we had sort of different students saying different experiences about how much sort of school-based career support that they got. And I do think sort of school-based career support can be a really valuable and useful tool in terms of trying to get some of that sort of more personal and specific guidance and advice that students said they wanted sort of from the focus groups. Rakera, I don't know whether you had anything else to add on that.
Yeah, I think that's where sort of people like personal tutors are really important, because they have had, that real life experience. More often than not, they've sort of had a little bit of a career before becoming an academic, or at the very least have seen other students sort of go through employability experiences. So it's looking at those sort of key professionals and encouraging students to have those conversations in their personal tutoring meetings, for example, or in their catch-ups with lecturers, making sure that they're discussing employability and really taking that initiative to sort of become a well-rounded employee post-graduation.
That's great. Thank you so much for the comments and for the presentation. I found them particularly insightful. And thank you. Feel free, everybody, to continue to ask questions in the chat box and on the Q&A box, and we'll try and get those to the presenters. Thank you very much, Ryan and Rikia. And we're now going to go for a quick 5-minute break, if everyone's okay with that, and come back at 1:15, ready for the last 2 presentations. So thank you very much. welcome back everybody. I hope you enjoyed your 5-minute break and the classic wonky music to keep you entertained. I'm a massive fan personally. We'll just get straight into it then. So we'll pass over to Rob from Bangor SU.
Hi, thanks Meg. Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Rob. I'm the Student Voice Manager from Bangor Students' Union. I haven't got a presentation to show, but I'll talk through our findings. Essentially, so we actually ran 6 focus groups at the end of last week, and we got around 8 to 10 students per focus group. So we had quite a lot of students involved, and because we managed to get so many students involved, we chose to cover sort of different sets of topics in each of the focus groups. And mainly tried to cover blended learning, that blended learning experience and how that might sort of work into the future, where the sort of gaps might have been in academic learning, what might have been lost, and also rebuilding student communities. And so we switched those topics up in the different focus groups, maybe focusing on sort of 2 with a main focus, then going into a sort of a sub focus if we had time. And we really just let the conversation flow. And a lot of the topics we were going to sort of prompt about came up anyway, so which was quite insightful. And then the biggest focus was definitely on online learning with too much time spent online in the same workspace, e.g. your bedroom, lack of social interactions and things like that, which are some of the things which have already been talked about as well. So what I've tried to do is summarise our headline themes, which I'll talk through now, but we are planning to put it down on paper a bit more as well. So when we do that, I can share those slides or that report. So the first sort of part was that in general, I think we know this as well, recording of lectures is great, so they can be looked back upon, but that's definitely not at the expense of in-person sessions. So it wasn't that the session was online which was good per se, it's the fact that students can watch the recording back, and some of the reasons for that came up were that they can obviously focus on what the lecturers are saying rather than hastily taking notes. Extremely helpful for people whose second language is English, so that again there's that time to look back and focus on what was being said. And also what came up was that online classes can often feel safer as well for some students, particularly if you're an anxious student. What was interesting though, I think, that came up was that there can be a feeling of time pressures when watching pre-recorded sessions. So that sort of, it flowed into that discussion about those sessions. And students sort of reported they can often take sometimes nearly double the time to rewatch because they're pausing the session. And although there's those positives that I talked about of they don't have to hastily take notes, because of that, there's pausing, there's perhaps rewinding. We all do it with a podcast, don't we? We might listen to a podcast and we go, oh, I'll skip back 15 seconds. So it doesn't just take that hour or that 2 hours. And that can lead to that sense of that overwhelming workload, which I think we picked up on as a students' union before, but I think possibly one of the reasons for that overwhelmingness is because of this pre-recorded lecture where you can then look back at it taking like so much more time. And what perhaps isn't taken into account there as well, if multiple modules have that set up, then other modules might not realize. So in terms of a whole program, you might not realize the sheer volume of work which isn't going into that program because the modules work on perhaps quite an isolationist basis. One bit of really good best practice that we came across sort of that might tackle this as well, but also help with that understanding and sort of the best of both worlds, I guess, was instead of having that full 2-hour lecture, whether that's pre-recorded or in person, one student reported a lecturer decided to have an hour recorded lecture where you'd sit down, watch the recorded lecture, and then have the 1-hour interactive session. And what the students were saying is this, they gave them time to understand the subject before having the live session. And that live session was about application, an opportunity to ask questions in that relaxed way. And it worked really well. Everything made more sense, they said, compared to their first year, where they had that 2-hour slot and less opportunities to ask questions. And those pre-recorded sessions were released about a week before, so they had time to look at them. They could do that in their own time. They did actually report still that 1 hour session maybe took them about an hour and a half to go through, so they understood the session, to write useful notes, but they did feel more organised. And that they could interact with the session better. But I think it was an important, so it works really well, but an important learning point from that is, just because you set an hour session pre-recorded and expect your students might spend an hour on that, they're not going to. They're going to spend a lot more time on that potentially. And also, what students reported in relation to that was that they had more courage to speak. One student reported they were particularly shy in lectures, but they felt that they would get themselves involved in the discussion because they'd had that time to prepare beforehand, whereas if they hadn't, they wouldn't have had that confidence and that courage to sort of step up and go, oh, I'll get involved in this discussion now, this seminar discussion. Another thing that came up about the recorded sessions, or the online sessions, sorry, was that students like being able to ask questions on discussion boards and comments rather than asking them out loud. I think that, that could be easily be enabled in an in-person environment with technology as well. So it's learning lessons about how students like to ask questions, and porting that over to an in-person scenario as well as the online. And then one interesting part, I guess, that came out was that consistency of platforms, that it can be confusing for students. One of our students quoted as saying, like, why do we need to install like around 60 different bits of software when Blackboard, that's the VLE that we use in Bangor, is good enough? And that can create confusion across platforms for students. Particularly online can be useful for some groups of students. So we had some mature students in one of our sessions, and they particularly reported that, well, I guess it wasn't necessarily just mature, they were mature students, but it turned out obviously these mature students were carers as well. And online worked well because they could juggle the course, working full-time, caring responsibilities, and they benefited from having that flexibility, and they could fall back on the sort of the comfort that online it's going to be there. I don't have to be available at that specific time, or I don't have to travel in. So it's that commuter student thing as well. So that flexibility really valued by certain groups of students. And also students who are on sort of more intensive courses and felt that the provision of online could be more beneficial as well, and perhaps going into the future, because they can engage from their desks, allowing them to be involved with more opportunities than they would usually have had time for as well. Although our international students reported that they did struggle, and I think that was more concerns about the induction and support to understand elements of their course weren't as clear, because it was all delivered online. So they needed clearer guidelines about how they were going to learn, and that wasn't there. They were just thrown into it essentially. And also they struggled to make connections as well with other international students, which was really important. And I'm going to come on to the sort of social interactions now, because what we hugely found, and I think some of our speakers today have touched on this, especially the earlier ones, was that the lack of social interactions, students believe that it leads to suboptimal learning. It's not ideal. And many reasons for this that we delved into, and many of them we didn't actually delve into, they came up organically from the students talking to us about them. I think Danny mentioned in the very first presentation about students being able to, I think, ask each other the answer to a question. And some of the things that came up was students are more likely to ask their peers for clarity on learning or when confused than staff members. And that's because there's a quote we had was, I feel stupid asking the lecturer something they will probably think is obvious, but they don't lack confidence to ask their peer that question, because they can just turn to the person in class and ask them something, and they were reporting that they can't do that online as easily. Also, they can't encourage each other in the same way with their learning. What we found was that students may well work individually, but they are sort of on their individual work. it's not a group task as such, but they often work in social groups, and that provides encouragement, a sense of that they're in it together, a place to ask questions and get those clarities of understanding. And what they also said, which I think was really interesting, that they value, well, I think it's obvious though, really, that they value relationships that they can forge with their peers, with like-minded people, rather than being forced to make social connections by lecturers. So they don't like that forced feeling of you must make peer-to-peer social connections. They like to do that organically, and that's really important for them. And in terms of the sort of learning loss, I guess, or like what they've lacked in their academically, they feel that their grades have dropped from their first year. Our students were reporting, and they feel that bouncing off each other in class does affect their performance, and that has had that negative impact on their grades. Also, what they reported, obviously, grades are an indication of how you're doing. And lecturer interaction does help to gauge progress, but sort of talking to your peers helps to gauge progress academically as well. So when you're talking to your peers and gauging each other's understanding, that's actually a form of sort of feedback for you and for you to gauge where you are, but they're not getting that as much. So they're only perhaps getting that from feedback that they get on assignments now, which does have a value to it, but I think they place more value on gauging where they are academically by talking to each other. So I think that's really insightful as well, and why that social interaction with learning is so important. Some of these things tapping into why that social element of learning is so important. They also really missed the moral support and the chance to sort of debrief each other after assessments, especially exams, and perhaps not thinking they were the only one who thought they'd completely and utterly like bombed out their exam, for example. So one of our students said that they were really stressed after an exam. Well, I'll read the quote actually. So when I had the exam for that particular subject, it was really hard. It was really hard, and there were loads of things that I didn't know. I just don't know if anyone else or anyone can back me up on this. But then I met there was this one student I remember, he was in a meeting and he also had his camera on. So I still remember his face like from 2 weeks ago. I saw him at the supermarket in Morrison's, and I was like, hey, do you remember me? And they got chatting. She said, I was in your class. Oh yeah, in that meeting, etc. And then we go on, she says, did you do this particular exam? And he had done this particular exam. She asked, how did you find it? And he said, really difficult. And for me, I was like feeling sick, worried, depressed, crying, overwhelmed, and all these sorts of exam sort of fever things that usually we have in the exam. And I thought I was the only one. And then what that student went on to tell us, that it was so like liberating to find out that they weren't the only one, and that other students had experienced this as well, and that it wasn't in isolation, and that they could support one another. And that was really important to her, but she hadn't got the chance for that. And so she was just anxious about that exam, focused on those things, that stress and anxiety, and there was no outlet for that, and no way to sort of in some ways help to alleviate those fears that she had with that exam. And the other part of the social interaction is actually with lecturers as well. So students want to be able to to network with lecturers and make connections with what they reported of people that with a wealth of experience and knowledge in their field. And online doesn't allow for that as easily. It only allows for specific questions on assignments or online learning. The other elements that came out really strongly are needing structure to life and work. So students need a structure to their lives and days to learn optimally, not just timetables, but getting out into different environments as well. Some students couldn't tell the difference between the weekend and the week, they were telling us. In fact, one of the students said, when it came to this was an international student as well, when it came to the Easter break, I didn't even realize it was the Easter break, as nothing has changed, and they were confused why all of a sudden like lectures had stopped what was going on, because they couldn't distinguish it. They were in their room learning, and that was it. And that was really sort of interesting to me, but also quite heartbreaking to the student. Like, didn't even realise where we were in the academic year, where that there was Easter break. So students need separate spaces for work and other aspects of life. Otherwise, they're too easily dragged into other things. They're demotivated by being in the same place all the time. And many of our students actually are agreeing with this one, that it was just super easy just to turn their camera off and go to sleep, because one of our students was reported that. They need that. What has come strongly, I think, is that they need that motivating support from each other as well, and they want to learn from each other, and that's vital. I mentioned about the overwhelming workload earlier on as well, and what they also feel is like lecturers are giving them loads of resources all the time to maybe their videos to watch, and it almost felt like it was to make up for what had been lost, but that in itself became overwhelming and was hard to prioritize, like which bits to watch and which bits not to, and it felt like they'd been bombarded. But was that because they felt that the lecturers were sort of acknowledging this isn't as good, so they were sort of giving them loads of stuff to try and make up for that? One of our students actually, I think, saying that lecturers took advantage of the designated number of hours that were on our schedules, pre-recording 2 or 3 lectures rather than 1 that was sort of supposed to be in your programme. Just too much work assigned and so much work expected to be done, perhaps thinking that you have more time because you're working online, but you don't. So that needs to be taken into consideration as we move to whatever way of working now, whether how that blended learning works going forwards. And they believe that there needs to be some ground rules as well that needs to be communicated across schools and between modules, so that modules don't work in that isolationist approach, that the programme as a whole is designed to fit together seamlessly. Yeah, and then the sort of one of the last things that I was going to raise actually was on group work. It was a sort of a bit of an aside, but I wanted to mention it. Was that we talked about group work a little bit, and that online allows for more flexibility in formalized group work and tasks and assessments, because it might be easier to meet up with your peers that you're working with within that for that group task. Although obviously from the rest of the things that I've reported, I think we could safely say that it's more optimal for them to meet in person a lot as well, but it does allow for that flexibility. But also what's strongly come out, and it's actually strongly come out in some other focus groups that we've been running as well recently, that there's quite a lot of negativity towards group work. And we didn't really have much time to explore that, but we want to explore that more in the future. And some of the things that have come up in some other focus groups that we've run are things such as when you go into a group, when you work as a team, in a sort of an office sense, you might have a manager, and when you're in a group, when you're put into a group scenario, just thrown, you go, oh, work as a group, but you're not taught how to work as a group, you might need to designate a manager. It might not work when all voices are just shouting. You need to sort of work with those team dynamics. So one thing we actually thought was calling it teamwork instead of group work, so quite a lot of interest there as well. So yeah, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was really insightful, and I was chuckling away thinking about my own group work experiences at university, and that really did resonate with me. So I think that's a really good point as well. I just really wanted to pick up on one of the things you said around organic interactions again and how powerful they are, but also what you said around the diversity of students. And someone's popped in the chat box around course design, and I wondered if you'd picked up anything around whether there's a role of learner autonomy, in terms of that we need to understand where our students are coming from and their experiences, but actually we're finding that their experiences are so diverse in terms of mature, international, and about how whether it might not be a one-size-fits-all approach, and whether there's a thing around the development of trust between students, or how do you kind of see that panning out, or what evidence you've collected on that?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting actually. So on that, one of the mature students in one of our sessions, there was one mature student, and there were lots of your stereotypical sort of like 18 to 23-year-olds, and she said, oh, but all you guys, you've probably got a totally different experience. But there was an appreciation of that as well from the group. So I think what would be really useful is to develop those appreciations amongst students, because perhaps being in that environment, hearing each different perspectives from each other was really valuable to them. And I think what happens is you get siloed as a student into your sort of way of working and what works for you, and don't realize that your needs might be different to someone else. But when you do hear it, it's like, oh yeah, that's interesting. And it was a really insightful discussion, having the mature students and your sort of non-mature students talking about their different ways of working.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's really good. We've got a question from Lauren Harrison just before we move on, and feel free to ask more questions in the chat, everybody, around, do your students get lecture recordings in one block?
So some of them did, and so what we sort of were finding is that that's not the ideal way to do it. So students would prefer it if it was released on, say, a weekly basis. So not necessarily released and you must watch this now, but released that week and you can watch it that week, but not go, right, here are all 12 weeks of recordings. That was too overwhelming.
Yeah, and what were the lengths? I think that was the second part of the question, in terms of that theirs are in no more than 20-minute blocks. Okay,
so there were some pre-recorded lectures, again, these weren't ideal, I don't think, were like a 2-hour pre-recorded lecture released. So they weren't just the small chunks. But what that example of the 1 hour pre-recorded and the 1 hour seminar, that really went down well. We'd say that was something that should be done to give that confidence to students as well, because they went into the seminar then, because a lot of students report that, oh, nobody talks in a seminar. But what you're doing then is allowing them to build the confidence to then talk about the topic in the seminar. Because perhaps the reason they don't talk isn't because they don't want to, it's because they're really nervous about saying the wrong thing. But if you've given them the time to prepare properly via this pre-recorded lecture, then they will talk more and get more out of it.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, and I think that's something that would have definitely benefited me during my time at uni as well. So I think that's fantastic. Amazing. Thank you so much for your presentation, Rob, and feel free to continue to pop questions in the chat, everybody. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Amazing. Thank you. And then we move on to our final presentation from Nick from the University of York Students Union.
Hi, everyone. Just to say as well, big shout out to everyone who's put loads of work into this. I feel like slight imposter because I've not quite done the same level of insightful analysis as everyone else, it feels like. But I suppose mine will be a bit of a dump from the focus group we ran on Friday. So in its rawest form, a bit like the guys at Public First were talking about, although I didn't drink wine whilst writing up. So a tiny bit of context. We went out to 2 types of students to try and get students in the focus group. So there were students who'd filled in previous surveys that we tried to get to come along. Unfortunately failed, and I think that obviously some people have had low engagement, some people have better. It's been a difficult time, I think, in terms of engaging students in this, and it'd be good to get some tips on how we get more bums on seats for focus groups and activities more widely. But the other group we went out to was an existing group. So at York, we've got a group of students called the Student Expert Panel, who are taken from Office for Students target groups, so less represented students, BAME students, low participation neighbourhoods, disabled students, etc. So they're a recruited group that are paid. So a kind of good source of focus group and information all the time, and they're set up as part of our access and participation plan. So 10 of those students agreed to be focus group, which was really good, and that naturally builds in diversity as well. So obviously we didn't get the kind of unengaged students that we were talking about with Public First, but we got a diversity of students, which was really good. And we looked at the theme of social connections as well, and establishing re-establishing communities, which was really interesting. I mean, one of the things that that I've noticed across the presentations is this link between the social side of things, the social connections and communities, and learning and teaching. I think that's what we need to take forward as student unions and the universities as we move forward, not siloing those two things. The fun stuff happens on that side of things, the student union, and the learning and teaching on the other, and we're really picking up how much students learn from social activities as well as within the classroom. So I'll get going. So I started by asking the students just a bit about their experiences during lockdown, but also what role connections and social connections play in their lives, really. So trying to bed them in before asking deeper questions about solutions and ideas. So the conversation veered towards hybrid and blended teaching initially. So students talked about the importance of those face-to-face sessions and making connections that way, and the community aspect of learning and teaching. One student, I think she was a medical student, talked about the importance of sharing experiences, just struggles in learning and teaching in particular, and being able to talk to people about that. Feeling like you could ask people for help was also framed as the important aspect of making connections with people. Lots of students talked about the need to get out the house as an important aspect of social connections, which is obviously even more important during lockdown. I think some people clearly got quite tired and bored of people they were living with, because that did come up a lot. Lots of the students, and we really went into a discussion about how social connections, social activities are also learning activities as well. So the importance of learning from others and picking up knowledge about how other students learn, and revision strategies and things like that. So that came up a lot. We had a couple of PhD students as well. Both were international, I believe, and they talked about during COVID how they weren't able to talk enough to other PhD students, and then they framed this in the context of learning about how to navigate supervision, learning about university processes. That was perhaps something that was lost during COVID, and again that was framed as a key aspect of making connections at university. Not being lonely came up time and again, and obviously that was framed in pre-COVID terms as a key part of university, making friends, not being lonely. The other aspect of that was just those informal conversations I suppose you have with friends and in social groups around careers and sharing opportunities as well as experiences. Interestingly, I think quite a few of the students talked about the importance of having a group to go to or a certain activity at a certain time in the day or time in the week, and I think that's come up in other presentations linked both to communities and learning and teaching. So really, they really placed a high priority on structure and having a routine, and I think that's obviously been hugely disrupted and impacted by COVID. We've done another piece of work that I'm going to submit to the Commission on Friday, a project called Life in Lockdown, where there was about 43 students who shared really in-depth stories of their experiences during lockdown. And on the learning and teaching side in particular, not having structure, not having a routine, kind of that everyday mundanity of living usually at home, really caused their learning to be impacted. So they really struggled to motivate themselves, but more than that, really struggled to kind of self-regulate. Other people talked about switching on phones and going to sleep, really struggled to self-regulate without that structure and routine. Some of the international students talked about the importance of orientation. So without social connections, they're even more disoriented in university, especially in that early part, and obviously that's been intensified during COVID. So simple things that universities sometimes put on, or that international students get through social interactions with other international students or with home students, stuff like where to get haircuts or where to buy certain foods and stuff like that was framed as really being quite important. And then meeting diverse and interesting people as well. That's something that was particularly important to students. And yeah, finally on the first question, the first theme, meeting friends through friends. I think that's obviously been potentially lost during COVID, but that was framed as being really important for in terms of social connections and forming friendships. So really finding an initial group and then gaining friends from that seemed to be the common route for the students in the focus group. And then, so the second question I asked was around what hindered and enabled social connections during COVID. The majority of them were barriers in terms of what hindered them, but I'll start with the enablers just to be a bit more positive, I suppose. The students talked about the fact that students wanted to meet people, that there was a real appetite to meet people, which was framed positively. A couple of students talked about, and this is maybe not in line with what other people have talked about necessarily, but that it was almost easier to do extracurricular things. So obviously the activities that student unions and universities were able to offer were limited and changed, but the fact that students could conveniently just go online like we are now and engage in events was framed positively by a couple of students. I think they talked about how online participation was easy, and obviously not for everyone, but for them personally, it helped their level of engagement. Another enabler was smaller groups. They particularly liked smaller groups online, and obviously as we've come out of certain lockdowns, being able to interact with smaller groups in person was really was framed as important. And then the couple of PhD students talked about research check-ins as well, so being a good source of social interaction with supervisors and other PhD students, being able to catch up on research and check in on how they're doing PhD wise really helped with social anxiety and just staying in touch with people really. And then the final enabler that a couple of students talked about was part-time jobs. I'm not quite sure which part-time jobs they've been doing during COVID, but maybe as they come out of lockdown. But they framed that as another key way of meeting friends and staying in touch with people. So in terms of what hindered social connections during COVID, we had a disabled student who talked a lot about obviously barriers to participation, but in particular talked about disabled students allowance and how that had been cut, and that obviously not just during COVID, but how that had affected her in particular. So that was a really interesting insight, and I think she in particular felt the barriers of online learning and having to participate online in social activities. Lots of the students talked about, and we'll talk about this more in the third question, but lots of people talked about how it was difficult to meet people on the course, and I think people have picked up on this in terms of online seminars and teaching sessions aren't necessarily conducive to students meeting each other, and there's something for universities to learn about how we organize and how we design courses. I think I popped it in the chat, but there is potential, I think, for courses to be a real enabler of social connections. It's just we have to think about how we design those and how we curate them. We had a couple of students of colour in the focus group, and they talked about feeling particularly socially isolated during the pandemic. Opportunities to make friends with other students of colour was limited, which was really interesting. Motivation was talked about a lot, and that was interesting how struggles with motivation in terms of learning and teaching kind of cascaded into their social lives. So not having energy, and I think someone talked about it, really struggling to form connections and even message friends and people because of that lack of motivation. And then there was also, I suppose, physical and emotional anxiety over group meetings was mentioned as another barrier to engagement. One student in particular talked about, because they were unable to drink, and obviously reasonably worrying, but I think it kind of spoke to that that issue of students feeling, or some students rather, using alcohol as a bit of a crutch. So it was often framed as an enabler pre-COVID, and that maybe wasn't there during the pandemic. Students couldn't go out or couldn't drink as much, and that was seen as an issue and as a barrier to them making friends, which was interesting. Okay, and then thirdly, we asked about academic communities, so forging relationships within courses, and obviously there was a range of departments represented, so it was context specific, dependent on which department students were in. Quite a few of the students talked about that there wasn't really any form of community activity or any proactive intervention by their department. They talked about that there was a lack of events beyond just curricular events, but they wanted those co-curricular events that I think Lily talked about earlier. They wanted those events that complemented their learning, that were within their departments, where they could make connections with students and staff, debates and things like that. But they weren't there. Quite a few students talked about academic societies as well. So the importance of academic societies in terms of facilitating interconnections between students on different streams within the department, but also different cohorts as well. So they talked about feeling quite restricted to making friends within their year group and within their course, and wanting to make friends and make connections beyond that limited cohort, I suppose. Feeling isolated within the department. So one student talked about feeling like an island, that the department only communicated with them in terms of assessments, so letting them know when assessments were happening or when they had a mark, and that felt quite very isolated. And also, I really got the sense that they were a bit miffed by that. So just being told about your assessment, or just being I suppose encouraged to hurry up with your assessment. That's how one student described it, when there's not been much communication before that, was quite galling. And then finally, a student from, I think she was doing a music education degree, which sounded really interesting, but she talked about the importance of learning in groups. I know it was talked about previously by Rob, I think, but she described a really positive group experience. She described it at the start as a kind of starting point for conversations, but that it was a really good way to make friends, and that she remained friends with people she'd done group work with as part of the curriculum. And again, I think that speaks to the need to design that group work in the right way. Not organized fun in a sense, but focusing on the process, focusing on the emotionality of group work will help in social connections, will also help in the learning. And finally, just some, I suppose, practical ideas, some recommendations from some of the students. I think the most interesting one, and it probably goes against what other people have talked about in terms of organic social connections and bonding and forming social groups. There was a student who'd studied abroad in the previous year, so she was an international student where she was, and they'd been thrust into a 10-person kind of peer group, or mentor group. So there was 10 people randomly selected. They were all international students, but randomly selected. And she described it as just being a kind of another layer of friendship group. But I found that really interesting, because I kind of probed her on, doesn't that feel like organized fun? What about the organic stuff? But actually, just having a bit of structure to it was, it sounded and felt to her like it was a real help and really empowering. And it was almost like not a secondary group, but she could have her friends that she made organically, and then another group to fall back on, which was really interesting. Have I got a couple 30 more seconds, Meg? Or yeah. Cool. I've drifted up. This is what happens when you don't have a visual or a presentation. Lots of the students obviously talked about in-person society events being the key as we come out of lockdown, and course days as well, and that maybe ties into what we were talking about with the with what happens on course and academic communities. Dedicated days where students aren't in lectures or aren't in seminars, where students and staff can get together, I don't know, coffee and cake or whatever, and dedicate that to really forming connections within courses. On the Students' Union side, I think that simply knowing about extracurricular activities was framed as a barrier that often, I mean, at York we've got about 200, 300 groups, God knows how many, almost too many, and lots of the students just simply didn't know about the breadth of opportunities, in particularly for second year students, international students, postgrad students, didn't feel like the activities were for them. And there's something about how we frame freshers. I know we've moved to welcome or induction, but we still frame it often, or still load it towards freshers, and that puts second, third year PhD students off some of the activities. And I think we're going to have to really think about that as we transition post-COVID, because obviously those connections, that participation within those groups is going to be particularly important, and we can't have large cohorts not feeling like groups are for them. And finally, there's a few more, but I know we're pressed for time. One student talked about quirky societies being a particularly important thing for him. So in terms of barriers, you mentioned Hummus Society, which I don't know if other student unions have Hummus Society. We do at York. He couldn't tell me what was in hummus, which was interesting. Couldn't tell me the recipe, which was quite worrying. He mentioned mayonnaise at one point, so that was worrying. But he talked about how quirky societies have the potential for students just to focus on the social aspect. So they're not doing anything. They don't have to be skilled in anything. They're not writing articles or playing a sport. The focus really is on eating hummus and making friends. So that was framed as something that was really important moving forward. And that was it. There was loads more, but I write it up and share it more in a less raw form. But hopefully that was relatively insightful and some useful tips there.
That was great, Nick. Thank you so much. And I think that was really rich in terms of what you've relayed to us, particularly around the diversity of some of the students that you've spoken to. In particular, for me, it really hit me around research students and the fact that it can be a relatively lonely experience as it is, never mind within COVID, and actually the value that you put on in organic interactions as well. So just quickly, what do you think should be the key focus long term in terms of, out of all of the evidence that you've had, what one kind of thing would stick out the most?
Yeah, I think, and this maybe ties into wider work we're doing, but not siloing social activities and learning and teaching. I think that's come up a lot, that students don't really care about where they're making friends or how they're making friends in a way. Maybe I'm speaking on their behalf, but that we maybe need to join up a bit more. And it was mentioned in previous presentations about the university promoting social activities and the benefit of social activities for learning and teaching. But I think we could go beyond that. I know at York we're thinking about how we develop academic communities in particular, but doing that in a partnership way. So some activities where we've got course reps, academic societies, staff within departments and student union staff as well, working almost kind of curating stuff together, which I think is the future, and definitely what I'd take from the evidence and the work we're doing more broadly.
And I completely agree with you on that, Nick, as well. So amazing. Thank you so much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Fantastic. And that brings us to the end of our session. And I kind of just wanted to wrap up really quickly in terms of some of the things that we covered around the importance of diverse voices feeding into our progression after COVID-19, which I think has really come out in terms of some of the presentations that we've had. The importance of the personalisation and embedding careers support and advice throughout the whole time of a student's life cycle, and the value of informal and organic interactions, which I think came up in pretty much every single presentation, and just how important that is, linking academic and social activities as well. And I just think it's really important to note that some of these things have impacted students pre-pandemic as well. A lot of the things around access and inclusion have always been an issue for some students, and that actually a lot of these fixes aren't just about restrictions lifting, but it's actually about taking deliberate steps to improve our access and our inclusion, and improving student social capital as a way of supporting them to develop confidence and attainment academically and socially as well. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for everybody who has presented today, but also to everyone who's come along and listened. It's been a fantastic session and I've really enjoyed it, and I think I've learned a lot. And yes, thank you very much, and hopefully see you all soon in some virtual room. So yeah, thank you very much.